Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tiffany, and I'm here today with Ed Monk, another one of our fabulous TacCon trainers, who's joining me for yet another episode of Meet the Trainers. Good afternoon, Ed. How are you?
I'm great, Tiff. Thanks for having this.
Always good to see you. And for those who haven't met you, haven't trained with you before, can you tell us all who you are and what you do?
Sure. I'm Ed Monk. I'm a retired Army officer. I retired in 2007 after 24 years active duty. Retired as a battalion commander of a cavalry squadron at Fort Knox, Kentucky. I did 2 years as a deputy in Louisville, Kentucky. I'm now a part-time police officer for my small city here in Arkansas. I'm a range master level certified handgun instructor and a shotgun instructor. My brother and I here in Arkansas own Last Resort Farms Training, which is about 30 miles south of Little Rock. And we do everything from handgun to precision long range rifle. But one of my niches that I've kind of focused on for the last 10 years is the active shooter threat and helping people understand the threat and those that want to, how to prepare themselves tactically with guns on how to better respond to them and stop them. I've been studying this for about the last 13 years. I give presentations. I do 4 to 6 conferences a year, like TacCon, and other than that, talk to a lot of law enforcement agencies, government agencies, churches, schools, universities, and more, a lot of businesses about this. We at Last Resort, we offer 1, 2, and 3 day classes on for armed people on how to stop the active shooter. I just got back from last month at a church armed security team out in Phoenix area, and I'll be up at the Firearms Academy of Seattle in April doing a 2 day class up there. And then for about the last maybe going on 3 years now, we do an active shooter instructor class for instructors that want to better understand this and put this in their curriculum. That's what I am, and that's what I do, I think.
You think? That is amazing. Yeah, and Ed, with all of that wonderful background that he shared with you, he failed to mention that he is one of a choice few folks at TacCon who have achieved the status of high comedian. So if you're in the Facebook group, you've already gotten a few laughs from Ed because he keeps everybody rolling. So he's got
Serious
the
stuff.
best sense of humor.
Serious.
I'm working on getting a prize for this year's TacCon bingo game. I really think that's gonna be a pretty tight competition. I'm excited, but
Well, is it true that I heard that you and Spencer Keepers and Tim Reedy are the finalists in the cannonball competition at the hotel?
no one ties with me for the cannonball competition. So they may
Okay,
be
well,
they may be tied for second, but there's no competition for first.
I'll be at the pool to watch the finals.
Okay, all right, fair enough. But it's hard to imagine, but there is something even more exciting than our cannonball contest, and that is Ed's classes at TacCon. So let's talk about those. First, you mentioned a minute ago, Ed, that you've kind of carved out a niche for yourself in this arena of active killer response, and you've got a course entitled Active Killer Response, or GTFIT. And if you don't know what that stands for, then you just got to come to Ed's class and you'll find out in short order. But this is a 4 hour classroom block on Saturday morning. And I've got to tell you, Ed, you've done this material a couple of years in a row, and it's always among one of the most well received, one of the most highly anticipated and celebrated, and most highly requested blocks at TacCon. I'll try not to spoil it for everybody, but if you think this is just your run of the mill class on active shooter response, you're sorely mistaken. Ed has put in countless hours of time and research and really getting the data. So I'll shut up now. I can't help but gush about this class because I just think it's so awesome how much work you've put into it. But for those who are looking to attend active killer response, tell us what they can expect.
Yeah, the two main things we're going to talk about, we're going to talk for 4 hours. We're going to look at several active shooter attacks, not just for the entertainment of it, but to try to understand the threat and to get some lessons learned. And I'll tell you up front, the two main things are: one, time and math is the only really critical thing we need to look at if we want to plan to improve our response. Time and math, that's it. The other thing is we as a nation have been getting this horribly, horribly wrong for 30 years. Even though it seems so simple, we as a nation just refuse to get this thing right. You know, in 1989, we had the Stockton shooting at an elementary school out there, and we had 35 people get shot by one guy with a rifle. And the only reason it wasn't more than 35 was that guy just decided to kill himself. He could have kept shooting more, but he didn't. So there it is. We know about it. 10 years later, we have Columbine. We get the same results. And again, the only reason it didn't go beyond 34 was because those two shooters just decided to stop and kill themselves. Cops didn't get to them for hours. And then almost 18, 19 years later, in 2018, we had Parkland. And what did we have? One guy goes into a school and shoots 34. We keep getting the same horrible results. And that's what no one is trying to fix. You know, if a doctor keeps treating a patient with leeches and they keep dying, eventually we have to stop saying, well, we just need more leeches or a different kind of leech. So I've gone TacCon here now for several years, but I've done Alert, ALETA, National School Safety Conference. So I go to these conferences, and a lot of the times, and many of them, there's a lot of school people and there's a lot of cops. And so here is what I have seen. There is a bunch of effort, money, and time put into what do we do before the shooting starts? How are we going to prevent it? How are we going to predict it? How are we going to assess and treat with mental health? How are we going to get the kids to try to, you know, say something if they know something? Before the first shooting, a lot of effort there. And then after the last shot, there's a lot of effort there too. Unified command, rescue task force. How are we going to clear the building? How are we going to treat and evacuate and account for everybody? But what no one is talking about is how are we going to stop the shooting after the first shot? How are we going to stop it in the first minute? No one. Now, cops talk about after we get there, how will we stop it? But that's, to me, that's irrelevant because that's 5 to 8 minutes down the road. So it frustrates me that no one is talking about what I think the most important thing is, and that's how do we stop it and keep the victim count low? So in showing the details of some of these attacks, we'll pull out lessons learned, but the biggest one is time. Every few seconds you let this cat keep shooting, more people are going to get shot. That's pretty darn easy. So we're going to try to help to understand that this is a different threat. As we teach it, there's 3 threats outside the home. And last TacCon and this TacCon, I'm going to talk about 2 of those. So the way we teach it, threat number 1 is the mugger. Well, 90% of the people in the training industry are training for threat number 1, the mugger, the parking lot experience. And statistically, it is the most likely. So a whole bunch of people doing that, right? Sub-second draw, parking lot guy. I'm going to talk about the other 2. And this one here is what we would call threat number 2, which is the active shooter. Different threat, different tactics that they're going to do, different tactics so that we should do, different guns they're going to have, different legal scrutiny, completely different. You know, the parking lot guy, some of them get violent, but most of them just want to show the threat of force, get your stuff and get gone. Well, you're going to know the active shooter has started probably after he shot the first several people. He is actively shooting people. He is doing violence, not just threatening violence. So completely different there. Understand what we're most likely to see and face. Understand how we can better prepare to face the active shooter. Now, we cover that in 2 different ways. One is an individual. If I, as an individual, am at a school, a Walmart, a business, a church, when this active shooter kicks off, what are my options and what are my best actions? But then also an organization, the leaders of schools, churches, the decision makers as an organization. How can we plan for this? Not just so that we check the block and we've got a plan in the notebook, but how can we plan for this that will actually save lives? And everything I do, that's what it's about. Not save every life, but how can we keep the victim count low? We'll focus in a little bit on schools and talk about them, and not only how schools are a little different, but how different schools are different. How elementaries are different than middle, and how middle are different than high schools, and so how they should prepare differently, and how armed people, whether they be cop or school staff that's in those schools, how they should prepare differently. We'll clearly show. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just gonna. I think you were pitching me a segue there, and you mentioned threat number 1 and number 2, and I'm wondering if threat number 3 leads right into the second class that you're teaching at TacCon.
Yeah, threat number 3, which we were unfortunately reminded pretty heavily of in 2020, right, is the riot and violent protester, and that's by far the worst. It is the worst tactically. It is the worst legally. it's there are a different number of threats of enemies, which is going to be a whole bunch. You don't know what they're going to do. And the biggest lesson learned, I think, take away from that threat is any resistance that we innocent bystanders, any resistance, whether it's an eye roll, a comment, a facial expression, or physical push, any resistance we offer has a huge chance of immediately going to deadly force. So we just have to understand that if we understanding this threat, how they act, any resistance we offer is very likely to go straight to deadly force. And then we have the worst tactical scenario where we have multiple people. We don't know which one of them are going to fight and which one of them aren't, who has weapons, who don't. So we're much more likely to get injured, even if we're well trained, much more likely to get injured by this threat than any other. And then we have the worst legal scrutiny. On the other end of the spectrum is the active shooter, where, and when I present on that, I show some technical mistakes that people made where, technically they might have broken the law, but it's an active shooter. Put him down. We don't really care. We will overlook anything. Whereas the riot or violent protester, even if you do everything, not only within the letter of the law, but actually right and reasonable, you could still get prosecuted. And I think we all know several examples of that. We're going to cover, I think, like 4 different events where we can take lessons learned out and actually see things, but it's pretty obvious. Even if you do everything right, because the other side has a bunch of videos and they have witnesses that will testify against you. And generally, when these riots take place, they take place in jurisdictions that are sympathetic to them. So they will let the riots keep going, which means the prosecutor of that jurisdiction is also probably going to be sympathetic to them and prosecute you no matter what. So, or even if you did everything right, and even if there's good evidence of that, and even if your very expensive attorney gets the verdict that you want, that a year of your life will be ruined, the rest of your life will be negatively affected, and you may be bankrupted depending on your financial situation. So, that's the biggest thing with the riot is understand how bad the tactical problem and the legal problem are before you decide to act, because it's probably going to go nuclear pretty quick if you decide to act.
Amazing. So, guys, I'm sure you can tell how passionate Ed is about each of these topics. And even though both of these classes have come to TacCon a couple of years in a row, believe me, not one presentation of these is the same. Ed's continually updating his information. He's continually adding new data. He's continually analyzing new events that have happened since the last time he gave these presentations. So if you've never trained with Ed on his active shooter response class or his riot and violent protest survival class, you've got to check these out. And even if you've seen them before, I guarantee you there's going to be some new information there that you may not have heard the first time. So, Ed, good sir, I am so glad to have you back at TacCon, and I can't wait to play bingo and to make everybody look bad in the cannonball contest and to give you a great big hug in Dallas. Thank you so much, as always, for sharing your expertise with the Range Master family.
It'll be here before you know it. See you there, Tiffany.
See ya.